Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And it's been a while since I said that. Today, I am joined by Malazan author Ian C. Esslemont, author of Novels of the Malazan Empire. Is it Novels of the Malazan Empire or Tales of the Malazan Empire?
I think it's Tails.
Tales of the Malazan Empire, and the Path to Ascendancy series. So, Ian C. Esslemont, Cam, how are you doing today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me, AP. And shall I introduce the topic for today?
Yeah. What are we discussing today?
Well, today we're going to take a look at the sanitization of warfare, and violence in the fantasy genre broadly.
I think this is really interesting because I don't think it's just fantasy that does this. But let's start with fantasy and see where we go. So we've been emailing about something and you'd suggested this. So why don't you lay out the argument, the sort of the where we're going with this?
Um, well, I suppose the broader to talk about fantasy in the broadest sense, um, really this topic is sort of a legacy. It's been with it, the genre and its roots of folk tales, legend, myth. It's been with the genre in since its beginnings, and one could argue that you just can't separate out um, some sort of facet of war, warfare, or violence from the genre. I mean, what would a fantasy novel be without swordplay, for example? Uh, Generally speaking, sort of like complaining about all the kissing and hugging in romance novels. Uh,
Here. Um, well, I both somewhat agree and somewhat disagree. I think fantasy as a genre now is incredibly broad. That
yes, very diverse. Yes.
And because of that, I think there are some we could call them subgenres or flavors of fantasy that lean more heavily into it. Epic fantasy, for one, I think it would
Yeah.
be incredibly difficult to write an epic fantasy that didn't have either warfare or um, violence, action. And I think that's the point that I want to make to come back to for a second. But just to finish this thought, there are other forms of fantasy. Like one of the most popular forms in the last couple of years is romantasy, the combination of a fantasy setting with a romance story, a romance narrative. And violence and warfare doesn't play or doesn't have to play as significant a role there. So I don't think it's inherent to fantasy per se, but I think there are some forms of fantasy that really lean into violence and be it warfare or more individual, sort of Three Musketeers dueling style.
Well, okay. Yes, some of the subgenres lean into it and some lean away from it. That's true, but I think it's more pervasive than you might think. Um, for example, in some many of these romances, these combinations of romance and fantasy, um, often one of the characters is away you know at war or called away and is at risk and may not return, and there's so it's off stage. It's still there, but it's sort of just they're leaning away from it. Other forms of under the fantasy, for example, Peter Pan, Kid's Tale. Never Neverland is in a state of perpetual warfare. There's uh, kidnappings. There is hostage taking. Someone's eaten alive. I mean, there's all kinds of violence and war. Lord of the Rings, of course, as we both know, it's just one long extended war narrative. So there it even those who say, "Oh, I don't come to romance fantasy. I'm not interested in violence and war. I'm not interested in that at all. I just read fantasy because it's fun, whatever." And yet, if you look closely at those narratives, where is the drama? Where is the risk coming from? And you need some kind of threat. There has to be something driving the narrative.
Yeah, and just to contrast it with something else, so say the like a Regency romance, the threat of violence is not the driving force. That's not the threat in a Regency romance. Quite often, it's a pecuniary threat, a financial threat, or a loss of status. That there are different threats, and yet frequently, I think when we look at fantasy writing, you're exactly right that the threat comes down to a fairly physical threat. And in fact, like the number of times people have said, if death isn't final, then it robs it of its importance and impact in the narrative. And yet, fantasy quite often involves stories with deities and afterlives and necromancy and all sorts of ways where that barrier between alive and dead is not necessarily as final as it is in our world. And that's part and parcel of a lot of secondary world construction, or the magical nature of the story world. And so applying that very rigorously seems quite strange, because the accusation quite often made is, oh, these characters have plot armor. They can't die. And yet when we think of action movies, particularly like 1980s action movies, where you had Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone, and it was like one guy against an army, and you knew they were walking away at the end of the movie. Like, no matter how many guys with machine guns were shooting at them, they were, oh, it's just a flesh wound. Oh, it's just a flesh wound. Oh, I managed to dodge out of the way of that explosion. And yet we accept it in
Yeah.
that format because
Yeah.
that's violence as action. And I think that is the point I kind of mentioned earlier, that for a lot of these things, violence and action have become synonyms, that they've become thought about as being exactly the same. And yet, as you point out with Peter Pan, there it's A, heavily sanitized, and B, it's presented as play. And of course, like if we think of the frame and context of Peter Pan, it's meant to be children's play and reflective of that in this fantasy environment. So it's not meant to be as nasty and as cruel and as realistic as a lot of these adult
Yes.
fantasies tend to be.
But there it is. And perhaps goes to my sort of point that I wanted to make about whenever people bring up violence in fantasy as a critique. And my point is, well, it's not because it's there, it's in many ways unavoidable, like swordplay. Um, Rather, say, for example, in Peter Pan, being presented like play, it's a children's story, granted, and all that. But does that mean that it's treated lightly? So I think that's where we get to the problem, where it's the topic is sanitized. It's presented in a casual manner,
Mhm.
violent, and so it's not the presence of it. It's rather how it's treated and how it's handled in that particular piece of work. I think that's really the problem that we're getting to. Um, I don't have a problem per se with wars of novels of war, of course, because it's one of my topics, and because I'm looking at the consequences of it. But there are other works out there where it's treated almost as if it's fun and it's glamorized almost, and that's where I have a problem.
When you had first broached this, like one of the things that immediately leapt to mind was Wilfred Owen's very famous poem, Dulce et Decorum Est, about the First World War and the realities of being in trench warfare in the First World War versus that sort of fictionalized, narrativized, jingoistic, patriotic, it is a great and glorious thing to die for one's country and it's a this noble endeavor. That that separation between the two, I think, illustrates kind of what we're talking about here, at least from my perspective. That on the one hand, you had Owen looking at and trying to relay to readers the realities of what war was like, the the repercussions, the conditions, that it wasn't a jape or a lark, it wasn't knights on horseback or dashing young officers doing daring do. That this was very serious, very dark, horrific, and he was trying to discuss that. And when we think of fantasy, the number of times the heroes resolve problems by, well, we just kill the bad guys, that it is treated almost a flippantly, but also as if, well, of course, there's no moral repercussion to killing bad guys because the heroes know for a certain fact that these are bad guys. The reader knows for a certain fact that these are bad guys. So it doesn't make any difference to us that these heroes are acting as judge, jury, and executioner. In The Lord of the Rings, the orcs, they are intrinsically evil. And therefore, the heroes of the story, be it the Riders of Rohan or the Men of Gondor or any group, the Dunedain, they can kill as many orcs as they want because despite the fact that the orcs speak multiple languages, they breed and have families. They are sentient. They can follow orders. They can disobey orders. That they are sentient. They are sapient. They have some element of free will. That, but they're intrinsically evil, so we can just kill them. And this was the orc problem was something that Tolkien struggled with. Like he never resolved it. He wanted bad guys that his heroes could kill, but at the same time, it raised major issues with the morality of the story that he was telling. And that's not me projecting that onto Tolkien. That was Tolkien in his letters, in his writing, has
Yeah.
talked about the difficulty that free will and orcs present. Because if they are intrinsically and irrefutably evil, then they can be killed with impunity. But how then can they have made these decisions? Why can't they be deprogrammed, as we would say today? Why can't they be saved? If they are descended from corrupted elves, can they
Hmm.
not over time be uncorrupted? Can they not be saved? That this was something that Tolkien struggled with. He didn't come up with a satisfactory answer that satisfied him. And I certainly am not going to attempt to do it for him.
Yeah.
But we have that in narrative and we see it in superhero stories. The number of people who complain, well, Batman should just kill the Joker. The idea of the homicidal vigilante. Whereas when we look at corollary to that, say the Punisher, someone who is a vigilante, but it was almost always presented either as an anti-hero because he acted as judge, jury, and executioner.
Wow. These tales that present these ultimate battles between ultimate good and evil. That's the problem, right? Then there's no moral crooks. There's no question. There's no dilemma. It absolves the hero of almost any horrific act that they might commit. All in the name of the greater good, right? And so that's to me, an easy out. It's almost like um, not being willing to ask yourself, well, there's that in every human. There's a good and a bad in every person. It's the human condition. Uh, and I suppose you can present these extremes as play acting or as just to test scenarios and things like that. But then, where do you draw the line between that and vigilanteism and the self-appointed, as you said, judge, jury, and executioner. That's um, maybe that is what's being tested. I would hope that maybe that is what's being explored. Right? At one point, does the Punisher finally sort of stand up in his tunnel and say, "Oh dear, what have I done?"
But because it's fuzzy, because a lot of fantasy, if we look at the fantasy genre as it evolved, say post Tolkien up until the early 2000s, and with the then emergence of grimdark becoming much more popular in the late 90s, early 2000s. But until then, there was a leaning toward almost a simplistic moral binary, the good
Simply,
guys and the bad guys. And because of that, these ethical and moral questions about war and violence didn't need to be broached because it was part and parcel of the story world. And yet, when we had that sort of movement into the emergence of grimdark and the exploration of rather facetiously grittier or more morally ambiguous, this movement towards a more realistic aspect of morality set in a fantasy world, that's when we got some consideration of the fact that you could have bad guys on the side of good, you could have good people on the side of bad, depending on which way the narrative was being spun. And it started to delve into much more realistic, almost to go back to Wilfred Owens, Owensian depictions of warfare and battle, of looking at that, the mud, the caked mud and blood crusting under the fingernails of these characters. And that's a far cry from the gleaming chrome of these knights or the wizards in their pristine robes striding into battle and launching a fireball at the enemies and burning people alive. And yeah, they're
yeah.
enemies. But that's
If
a
you
pretty horrific death.
Yeah, if you're dehumanizing the enemy, and history has taught us this, if you dehumanize the opposition or whoever the enemy is, ultimately you dehumanize yourself, and so you're not only presenting the enemy as, say, subhuman, for example, or not worthy of human considerations, um, and start doing these things, these horrific acts, you are at that time dehumanizing yourself. You are somehow t taking out elements of your human nature in order to accomplish those things, and you become the monster.
But like when we think of like some of these stories, and it's not just the emergence of grimdark. I put a label on that because it's a very handy where people can go, oh yeah, but like there's an entire subgenre develops that starts looking into this far more frequently. And if we look at a lot of the earlier stories, you had that the paragon of virtue. You had these very clearly defined, simplistic, and often quite reductive views of the sides in a conflict. And some people get annoyed at the idea of the deconstruction of the hero. But in sort of the movement of modernist literature into postmodernist literature, where we have this removal and questioning of the certainty of narrative positions and this embracing of narrative uncertainty. And that applies to moral positions, it applies to cultural positions. It starts questioning the nature of these things. And I think that whole movement of the rise of modernism and then the rise of postmodernism in literature lends itself as a way to explain this increasing depth and complexity of questioning these certainties. Because when we think of going back to the Lord of the Rings, the very question that Gollum, as an evil creature, unabashedly so, like he's never painted in a good light. Gollum is evil. From the first murder of Deagle all the way through to him strangling goblins and eating them. Um, Gollum is evil. The idea that Smeagol, as an alternate personality coming forward, who is fawning, subservient, maybe not as evil, but even then is convinced to try and feed Frodo and Sam to Shelob. But within that narrative, there is certainty that the heroes are right, that they are doing the right thing. And they can be flawed heroes, Theoden, under the thrall of Wormtongue. They can have fallen from grace. Saruman, a spirit, basically an angel in mortal form, falls from grace. Sauron himself, fallen from grace. It's not that you can't have people who start good and end evil. That falling from grace, that tragic hero or the tragic arc of a hero, that happens in literature and has done for thousands of years. But the certainty that we have that the heroes are good, the ring bearers are good, the quest to destroy the ring, that is good. It is, we are absolutely certain about that. Who's on the side of good? Who's on the side of bad? That Tolkien's writing, as sophisticated as it is, and he adds in much more moral complexity than a general sort of overview or summary of it allows for discussion. But when we think about it in those general terms, there is a very clear moral binary, and we are very certain about it. But then when we move into much later works, it becomes less certain because there's a growing awareness of things that have been taken for granted in literature, Orientalism, colonialism, all of these
Mhm.
different facets, this demonization or dehumanization of opposition. And in fantasy, we can literalize that. Why have them fight humans? We can make them physically look like demons and call them something different. That makes that separation nice and neat and clear. And yet, when we move into a lot of the later fantasy works, there are a lot more conflicts between nations, between races of humans, societies of humans, where it's not necessarily as clear cut. It's more closely modeled on a lot of the tensions in our own world, our own reality. And to demonize an entire nation or an entire religion or an entire group of people, to demonize that, we recognize that that is overly reductive and it's harmful because no major group is homogenous like that.
And yeah, going back, as you said, going back to Lord of the Rings, but even that as you brought up, that World War One, like I think that's seems to be the dividing line. Like you, and so much of this in Tolkien's drawn from his experience there, and for us in the West, so much of our learning comes from lessons from World War One. Not that that stopped us from repeating ourselves, but
Well, everyone
yeah,
likes a good sequel.
yeah, so for at least it's heartening, let's say, that many in the West would listen to what was Conan's words from the film to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women. Many of us would realize that that's not to be taken seriously.
But if we think back, like one of the first major narrative genres to be studied in terms of genre as a specific discipline was the Western. The white hats and the black hats, the lone hero riding into town who kills all of the bad guys.
Yeah, it was studied as a mythiopic sort of overlay on yeah.
And when we think of the evolution of the Western, think of how, you had the quite child-friendly or family-friendly versions, again, white hats, black hats, and you sort of Roy Rogers characters. But then the evolution of that over time to become darker, to become much more complicated, where it was a bad, flawed, terrible human being who happened
Right.
to be fighting on the side of the good guys.
So you move towards, say, Shane, for example,
Mhm.
where you have he's a hero, but he's fallen and he's trying to hide his past, and but then he gets drawn out because of circumstances, and he has to fight again. But because of that, he has to leave because he's disrupting the community. And yeah, that's just then you get all the way towards even darker things where Clint Eastwood sort of puts an end to it uh, with what's the title of his film where he comes back from retiring. Um,
That wasn't Tombstone, was it? Oh no, that's a different one.
no, this is later.
Oh,
Uh,
uh,
I'm very sorry. I
hmm.
brought up something I.
I don't have my list of all of the westerns. Otherwise,
Can't
I go, oh
remember.
yeah, it's that one. But we see that evolution in westerns of, and again, it's not using the law to take down the bad guy. It's like, no, we're going to form up a posse, we're going to kill them, or we'll set up a. It's lawless and barbarian and uncivilized. And then when you think of things like The Enforcer or Dirty Harry or those cop shows, where again, it's the lone cop who is going to just go and kill the bad guys instead of arresting them. And, that becomes part of mainstream storytelling of, again, Lethal Weapon. Compare the first Lethal Weapon movie to the last Lethal Weapon movies. But in it, you know, Mel Gibson's character, Riggs, kills a whole bunch of people instead of arresting them. That this is we had the whole TV show with Timothy Olyphant, Justified. About it when is it justified to shoot someone, and for his character, it was pretty much every episode. That, but or all of these shows, which we can see the narrative DNA of the stranger riding into town, the Western. We can see that narrative DNA in these cop shows or these various law enforcement shows.
Mhm.
We see it in superhero stories. We go from a lot of superhero stories where the superheroes are helping people and resolving issues and punishing bad guys. Like some of the earliest Superman stories, like Superman's a bit of an arse, but um, and they a lot of the stories move from that to suddenly it's about fighting with and trying to beat villains. It's not about saving people anymore. It's about these factions fighting or these individuals fighting. So again, it's the violence and action being conflated. So I think it's not just fantasy that does this, but it's fascinating that we have so much violence being depicted as A, necessary, and B, that you can be certain that you're on the side of good and do the things that if you actually think about what it is that people are doing, you go, that's not necessarily cut and dried good actions.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the fascinating things about this in fantasy literature, particularly with when we had that slow build up toward an embrace of aspects of grimdark that although there's a different aspect about that we could talk about, but this moral complexity that from World War One, from World War Two, that the realities of what violence can do, the repercussions of what violence brings, the psychological toll and toil of violence, when you are aware of this, in essence, empathy of some kind,
Yeah.
that the only people who can perpetrate violence without considering the repercussions are either certain that they are the good person and that the person they perpetrated the violence on was the bad person and deserved it, or they just lack a significant chunk of empathy. And narrative, fantasy storytelling, any form, almost any form of narrative, is usually simplified. There has to be an element of simplification that reducing to a simplified, reductive moral binary makes it easier to tell the story of a particular type of story. But as soon as we increase that complexity, that's where, you can have fascinating stories, but it's moving away from what you identify from folklore, from fairy tale, all the way through to Tolkien, that we had the clear designation. These are the heroes. This is their story. They are the good guys.
I'm not one to forbid the telling of any sort of story. You can have flawed, sociopathic uh, protagonists, let's say.
Yeah.
Uh, Certainly, and you can tell those I think those stories should be examined, actually, like Capote's Cold Blood. Um, and so it really, as I was saying before, it's the way that it's presented, it's the treatment of it, and the exploration of the consequences and all that sort of comes afterwards. And I think that that calls attention to the costs, not just in terms of lives, but in also on the survivors, psychological, emotional, etc.
Yeah, and I think science fiction found a really neat way to deal with a lot of this, which is, if you think of Battlestar Galactica, the Cylons, well, they're just robots. And therefore you can destroy lots of robots because uh, that's fine. They're just machines. They're not sentient. And then we see the use of derogatory language, even to reduce feeling bad for these semi-thinking machines, that they're called toasters. Again, that dehumanization of the enemy. We see that in Battlestar Galactica. It's fascinating that, looking back at Conan is a lot more complicated than the film portrayals
Oh
make.
yeah.
Like Robert E. Howard's stories are a lot more complicated. But again, that idea of the rigid moral code, or, I live by my own code and I'm not going to, society or civilization is corrupt. That when we take very reductive views of that, I think that's where it becomes potentially quite a harmful, overly reductive, overly simplistic
Yeah.
sort of lesson, as opposed to understanding the nuance that Hard builds into the stories, understanding the nuance of the world. And even then, Hard stories, like they do have some of the language in it to describe certain people is
Yeah. In the
choice.
original stories, there is a lot of there's racism, and because it's in the air, it's from the period. There are certain attitudes, but yeah, there's a lot more complexity there than contemporary film depictions have sort of taught popular culture. But to another point on the science fiction, but there are, of course, famously. A science fiction film used that dehumanization to make fun of the whole thing, which the bugs, um, and Verhoeven's Star Starship Troopers, and but there, of course, he was making fun of this whole reductive approach of dehumanizing the enemy, and saying, "Look how easy it is to do this, and how it serves the purpose of this fascist government." A little bit too neatly.
And it's interesting because media literacy is the media literacy, or literacy in general, is the thing that allows us to see what Verhoeven is doing. That the use of something that we as humans, as mammals, find instinctively disgusting, these insects, but to use that to go, well, hang on a sec, because he depicts it brilliantly on screen, and it's this wonderful moment where you see the map of the galaxy, and it goes, here is Earth, and Clondathu is on and we can't let the bugs survive when there's an entire
The other
galaxy.
side of the entire galaxy. Yeah,
And
yeah.
but that justification, so they look horrible. They aren't human. They don't have our same sort of society or sentience. But how easy it is to warp into that propaganda, that that justification. And then those wonderful propaganda videos where it's, like, I'm doing my part, and then it's the kids stomping on cockroaches. That to hammer this home, that this look at the external, look at the dehumanized enemy. And this is not to say that the bugs are the good guys. And again, that movement toward a simplistic binary is the issue. That
But even in that film, we you also see, as I'm t saying, um, how the human society becomes insect-like. You have these people becoming all the same, like becoming almost like ants in their uniforms and in their ranks and in their behavior. The human society has to become insect-like in order to match or meet or fight this made up enemy. And that and also is an interesting example of how it goes both ways. It's a two-way road.
Verhoeven did that very, very deliberately because you have Rico and the mobile infantry are the same as the warrior sort of run around arachnids that stab people, and then you have Ibanez as the flyer, and of course we see the flying ones, and then you have Carl's character played by of the actor who played Doogie Howser. Showing my
Yeah,
age there that I went with Doogie Howser rather than Barney
yeah.
Stinson.
People are going, who?
Neil Patrick Harris. But
Neil
Neil
Patrick Harris.
Patrick
Good
Harris,
for you. You pulled it out. Yes.
Neil Patrick Harris as the brain,
By
and
the
we see
brain.
him touching the brain bug. That each of the characters represents those castes within the human society, and it's mirrored physically with the insect society. Verhoeven wasn't like it is not a subtle film, and wonderful for that. Um, But it's fascinating because the whole idea, even the scene with the two talking heads, where one of them posits, with this sort of stratification, with this level of complexity, we would expect a sort of brain bug, and the other person being, I am offended by the very idea that bugs could think, and yet that's the case that there was a brain bug. Um, but the need for the bugs to be absolutely dehumanized, monstrous, alien, other, and to be able to kill them without any aspect of, oh, is this the right thing to do? So of course it's the right thing to do. We're humans, they're bugs, therefore we kill them. And then thinking about it more in the abstract of how many conflicts through history how many conflicts through history where we had one side absolutely 100% convinced that they were in the right and the other side were all evil.
Well, this is the majority of human existence. Just look at the propaganda on the sides of Egyptian uh, stelae and their great pharaohs off in their chariots to crush the evil enemy. It goes back all the way. Gilgamesh being lauded as a great king because he destroyed rival city-states. They think about that. The crushing of other nascent beginning civilizations, and that's wonderful because our king did it. And so,
Alexander the Great. Alexander
yeah,
the Great
this
was
is
great
the
because,
inheritance that we're struggling with. This is what I would hope that we can sort of try and overcome.
yeah. Um, but it really is quite fascinating because George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, like that was fascinating as one of the most popular and well-known examples of starting to deal with, well, hang on a sec, not everyone is clean and good. Not all of the bad guys are actually bad guys. Um, that it massively complicated the picture. Robert Jordan did some exploration of this in Wheel of Time. But again, in Wheel of Time, he needed no, these people are absolutely evil. It's the devil essentially is absolutely evil. Trollocs are absolutely. He still had the absolute
Yeah.
evil created in the world so that heroes had someone to kill without worrying about it. But
Well, yeah, Martin's song Fire, Ice and Fire. The to show all of that real politic fighting and infighting and the factions battling each other. Yeah, that's great. It's the taking a real world politics and presenting it through a fantasy lens. But to just say, well, everyone's dirty, to just say, well, we're all evil, or we're all selfish, or we're all gray, it doesn't go far enough, I think. You need to then people I need to actually start looking at it in themselves and acknowledge that it's within themselves that they have both of these impulses, and it's up to us to, how we handle
and
that.
it's interesting because even with the Song of Ice and Fire, we still have a faction that is inherently evil, which is the White Walkers. Like there's still a no, no, no. You can still kill these things with impunity, and humanity should come together because the real danger is actually the evil people. So that existential evil threat is still like a very functional part of the narrative. Um, so it's fascinating that even in something as politically and morally complex as a lot of Martin's writing is, that it still added that element in because that's such a useful tool within fantasy storytelling.
They were fighting for their own existence as well. So once you actually make that leap and look at them, you could say, well, they need the world to be really cold.
Oh dear. Um, but I think this the sanitization. If we think the Three Musketeers, think of the movie versions of the Three Musketeers, where you have that, it's this 20-minute sword fight and all of this fancy fencing that, we generally, and oh, look, a whole load of nameless bad guys have been killed.
Well, wait, which version? I mean, there are some that really overcome that. I'm thinking of with Michael York, the earlier one. There, it's treated very differently. The fighting is actually quite comic and in a sense realistic, in that people are just throwing things and doing whatever they can and fighting and falling down um, and actually they don't look very competent.
No,
It's a
but
very
again,
accurate presentation.
but they do have, like, say, a number of the Cardinals guards who just get killed,
That's true.
and
We have
and
the
they're
red shirts, even there, red shirts.
red shirts as the meme, or it was in one of the, it might have been in Clerks, one of the Kevin Smith movies, where they're talking about, well, what about all of the contractors, the independent contractors who were working on the second Star Destroyer, when suddenly these rebels just show up and blow it all up? Well, it was a government contract. They're doing their best to make a living, and they're sitting putting things together.
Right.
But for Star Wars, the Empire being evil, the rebels being good, again, that fairy tale moral binary, which is so useful and fun. And then you take something like Andor, where they take the Star Wars universe, but are telling a radically different form of narrative, that it has a different audience, it has a different focus, it has a different intent, that Star Wars, the movies, were action adventure. Andor is this tense sort of political espionage thriller. Um, and that is dealing very clearly with a lot of the moral questions that go with an insurgency, that go with a rebellion, that the destructive nature of living secretive lives. And we can see that in some of the different espionage stories where you have, the exciting hijinks and daring do and adventures of the Mission Impossible franchise
Mhm.
versus something that's looking at the level of and impact of paranoia on someone who is living in those sorts of environments where they're constantly under threat, where they're undercover, where they can't trust anyone, they have to hide huge aspects of their lives. That a
Yeah.
narrative that explores that is
Right.
radically
Well,
different.
okay, there we have the human cost. Yeah.
Um,
The cost on their psyche, on their emotional state, on their psychological state, and their humanity. You know, how full a human experience can you have there? You can't. You can't have a fully human experience if you are, as you say, right, living on the run, constantly under threat, paranoid, and as long as the narrative, or rather, I should say, the work examines that and or acknowledges it or treats it in some way, then at least there we're seeing it being brought forward and examined in some way.
yeah, and like one of the more popular TV shows a few years ago was Breaking Bad, where a genuinely like nice-ish high school teacher, uh, series of circumstances, and we map his decline, the corruption of who he is, the corruption of his family, this moral corruption seeping into their lives of his actions. It's following those repercussions. And the thing is, it's enthralling television, but at the same time, we're lured into this. Modern depictions of Sherlock have leaned into Sherlock being a sociopathic, amoral character instead of someone who is out to help people and solve these impossible crimes. That actually, um, there was the BBC show Sherlock, and like he just kills someone, and you're like, what? There's
Yeah,
without
yeah,
any of
that's
the repercussions of it.
uh, but to start examining these things, I think is good, and maybe it's of the time of our period that these narratives are starting to act, are not starting, but have been for the last couple of decades, looking at these issues and treating them. And they're, I think that you can acknowledge that, as you said, for Star Wars, it's for kids. There's simplification, and there are some useful tools like ultimate evil, ultimate good that are shorthand to get larger ideas across. And that's all well and good, but let's not pretend that that's the whole of our experience. And let's try and look up from that. And so within the fantasy genre, for example, you earlier on, you were getting towards the conflation of action and violence, to revel in that, to in a sort of an immature way, um, laud violence as some sort of a solution is that's a keeping to the childish narrative, in my view.
I know, but it's something that is so thrilling. Think of the number of fantasy characters in your work and in Erickson's work who are assassins and also heroes. And you're like,
Oh, the chickens have come home to roost.
oh, oh,
Yes.
Mr. Esslemont's throwing
Yes.
stones. Those are very transparent walls that you're sitting there with. Um,
Yeah.
but within like this is one of the big fantasy tropes that I find absolutely fascinating. The idea that of the heroic assassin, and we like Jason Bourne, John Wick, James Bond. Like we have all of these pop culture as well as literary versions of these characters who, and again, as long as they're killing bad guys, we don't mind.
Right. Well, as long as they're serving the purposes of the political entity in of which they are a part, then that's fine.
And one of the fascinating things about fantasy is the idea of the assassin as hero is very, very common. And also the assassin as bad guy. In R.A. Salvatore's series with Dritz,
Yeah.
um, Artemis Entreri or whatever his name is, like he's the evil bad guy because he's an assassin. And you're like, but hang on a sec. all of the other characters just go around killing people and things as well. But
Yes.
and he gets paid up front for it, so that makes him bad.
Well, once we get into the character and start looking at the character, suddenly we see that, well, actually, they're more complicated than you would think. And I would hope that the author achieves that by coming in close to that character. And on the outside, they might look like this sort of just standard issue evil killer. But when you actually get in and start looking at them more closely, you start seeing the complications and the choices that were made, the backstory, et cetera, et cetera.
Because, like, obviously, both you and Erickson, the way that you had designed a lot of the squads within the various military factions, very similar to like a D&D adventuring party, where you had this sort of the tanky could absorb a lot of damage and protect the other's character in the heavies. You had the sappers who high DPS because they were throwing explosives. You had an assassin character who would run around and get people. You had mages. So you had this in the squad formation of a lot of the military units,
Well, that's
right?
all. That's our D&D roots there, but it's also real life military squad experience as well. The any sort of small infantry unit would have a heavier weapon with them, like they might be carrying lighter automatic weapons, but they would also maybe have a 30 caliber or some a bigger gun with them that two or three would have to carry. They would maybe disassemble it and carry the parts of it. And then you would have a scout, a recon specialist, and you would also have maybe a medic, someone who can has some rudimentary medical training in that unit. So it comes out of basic infantry tactics as well.
Yeah, I wasn't having a go at you at that. But what
I'm defending my power.
but that concept of the balanced party, the one of the reasons why I think it's so popular and works so well is there are any number of different scenarios and problems that can be thrown at those characters, and you have a very flexible tool set of how you're going to deal with it. So within fantasy, dealing with it with magic, dealing with it with stealth, dealing with it with a one-on-one fight. There are all these different elements because you have a party made up of individuals that have these different strengths and characteristics and abilities. The idea of a special forces squad having a sniper, someone who specializes in that, or a high explosives expert who's going to be carrying those things, and a heavy weapons guy, as well as standard guys and a medic. Like that all makes sense because, again, it's about the flexibility of dealing with any unexpected issue. You go, okay, here's our mission. We're going to do this, but this thing has arisen. Well, because we have all of these different skills available, there are multiple ways that we can deal with it. It's a very flexible tool, particularly within narrative. I don't have a
Yeah.
problem with
So
that.
it's not it's not the warriors that here again that we're talking about. It's the mission. That's the problem. What are they being sent to do? What is the assignment? Um, what are the actions? And so we see that in a wonderful war movie, Black Hawk Down. Uh, we get the really a nice, very realistic presentation of a small occupying force making a quick dash into an urban warfare setting to achieve, well, essentially to kidnap some people. And the whole thing goes haywire and they get pinned down and can't get out. And then in the end, it's all for naught. I mean, most of the people are killed that they're trying to get out, and the whole uselessness and stupidity of war in the small scale, and that denunciation is presented brilliantly.
And that I think, again, to go back to a point that you'd raised, that the moral binary, the moral simplicity, works so well for children's family-friendly narratives or didactic um, narratives, parables and fables that have that moral message running through. That we accept that lack of moral complexity and that lack of sophistication because it's intended to be part of that. In the Star Wars universe, for the major movies, like they are aimed at something that is understandable. So you have like, oh, Darth Vader, he's evil, and there's clear color coding. The Empire are all bad guys, the rebels are all good guys. Like it's nice, clear, because it's straightforward for that younger audience to view and understand. Going to Andor, that is not for a young audience. Like that, it's much more complicated. We see the messiness of what that reality would actually be like. And
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons it's so compelling, because the setting itself, the Star Wars universe itself, doesn't insist that you must have good evil. That's a framework for the narratives, the movies, because the setting itself you can make as complex as you want or as simple as you want. And it's the same with a lot, I think, of fantasy settings that quite often we don't question the construction of the story world. And so, yeah, of course, the orcs are all evil. Like we see them do evil things. The orcs must be evil. Therefore, we can just kill the orcs. We don't question that the author created that and made it an integral part of the story world. And we don't think, well, why? Why have that? Why make it that easy? What is being missed out here? And it could be that the author doesn't want to focus on that. It's not that type of narrative. Or it could be a reflection of a political or an ideological stance that is being literalized within the text. There are all sorts of different reasons. You mentioned
Target audience. Um, yeah, written for YA or written, as you said, for younger readers. Yeah.
and one of the points that I've brought up previously about the Lord of the Rings, and again, I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings. Like, look what I ended up doing my PhD in, and what I ended up spending decades of my life studying because of Lord of the Rings. But after the battle at Helm's Deep, the Battle of the Hornburg, when there a bunch of the orcs left, and the Ents shepherd in the Huron, the moving trees, and the allies, they listen to the orcs being massacred. And then the next day, the trees eventually disappeared. And there's barely a trace that the orcs were ever there. And it's wiped clean, a tabula rasa. And you look at that and go, but that was a genocide. That was mass murder. That they just destroyed. And defenders of Tolkien, I would have to say misguided defenders of Tolkien, Tolkien doesn't need defense for this. It's part of what he was portraying. But they were saying, oh, but the orcs were evil. They deserve to be wiped out. And you go, that's not the point. The world was designed to have that, so that could happen without us feeling bad about it. That's a decision about the story world. That's a decision about the world building. That's a decision about the morality of this. And again, as I said, Tolkien had an issue with it because he couldn't fully resolve this issue with the orcs. But when we have that moment, the heroes never once question, hang on a sec, that's thousands of sentient, sapient beings that were just murdered and have been disappeared. And oh yeah, but they were evil, as if that answers the question. You go, but the reason they're evil is because that's the framework of the story world. Think about it from outside that framework, where we watch one side wipe out the other side, and no one worries about it. You have a scene in one of your novels in which basically the fantasy version of an aerial bombardment and napalm rains down on a phalanx of these perfect warriors. And the warriors had been attacking people. And the people watching these warriors be killed have a visceral reaction of seeing this level of destruction. And it's an incredibly moving, poignant and powerful moment in the narrative where 30 seconds prior, oh yeah, I'd do anything to have those guys killed because they're trying to kill us, you know. But suddenly seeing that level of destruction, that level of barbarity, that level of death, the defenders are rocked by it because even though they were on opposite sides, even though they were fighting, even though it was life and death, to see that happen was taking it a step further. And it was very much, it reminded me very much of, again, those discussions about World War One or World War Two, where those moments when it's not a fight anymore, it's the mechanized, economized destruction. And you go, this is no longer a fight. This is just a process. And we have reduced the enemy to parts of a process. And it's the ultimate dehumanization. And it's
We
frightening.
here, yeah, we here in the West are privileged at this point in time. 1945, the end of World War II. It's 2025, 80 years. 80 years of not peace. There's been many, many, many wars, but not a gigantic, convulsing global catastrophe. Uh, we haven't been called up, our generation or prior our kids, massively called up to march to.
Well, sorry for the break in the recording there. Someone else popped in for a quick chat and we were catching up and then now back to the recording. But Cam, one of the things that we've kind of skirted around was the distinction that we were trying to make between this topic about not sort of examining the repercussions and the sanitization of violence versus the valorization of violence, which is a topic I think would be fun to discuss a different day. Because while they're
Yeah.
related and overlapping, the valorization of violence is a topic in and of itself. What do you think?
Mhm. I agree. And interestingly, they're both simplifications. Um, to sanitize it is a simplification, a reductive simplification, and even to valorize it and to glorify it is also, of course, a reductive simplification. Um, but yeah, that's another topic for another discussion.
But oddly enough, one of the things that came up, and I think it fits with what we were talking about in this video, that just when we had our aside there, was we were talking about H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds and H.G. Wells' short story, The Land Ironclads. And I
Hmm.
think it's really interesting because The Land Ironclads uh, is talking about the mechanization of warfare
Hmm.
and this sort of the way that Wells frames it, it's the urban proletariat has designed these efficient killing machines, predating the invention of the tank. And they are faced off against in a class system, essentially, against the noble elite who are still using horses and they're riding in as a cavalry charge, very much similar to um, the, the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, that idea of the noble sort of warriors.
Hmm.
But Wells presents it in a very mundane, prosaic fashion of no, we're going to invent more efficient killing machines, and it predates the invention of the tank. And I think that mundanity of violence is part and parcel of what we saw happen in World War One. And the idea of, well, if this is the base level norm of the world, this is something we see a lot in fantasy writing. This assumption that that level of violence is the base norm, that it's mundane and therefore unremarkable. And I think that is a very strange shift in terms of the moral values associated with violence. And we see that being very commonplace in fantasy writing. And you had mentioned hard earlier. the world that Conan is in is, brutish and violent. And yet, because of that, then the violence is reduced in terms of its almost importance and impact because it's a day-to-day thing. And I think
Mhm.
that's something that fantasy builds into a lot of its story worlds.
Well, we were also discussing how interesting it is that over the last few decades, that's at least becoming there's an inward turning eye, a questioning and an examination of these assumptions. And fantasy writers are looking at that and participating in that postmodern, um, post-structuralist authorial approach to their subject. And some are actually examining that and questioning it.
And of course, like that models a lot of what is happening in our world. The assumptions about patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, um, misogyny, that what was accepted as a base cultural norm is now being interrogated. And this comes back to discussions that I've had where people say, "Oh, we don't want modern politics in fantasy," and yet so much of the richness of modern fantasy is dealing with these things in a fantasy milieu of
Yeah,
taking.
as we've seen, fantasy and science fiction is the perfect place, the perfect vehicle for an examination of these issues. That's almost the whole point of being able to step back from the norm and posit an example that interrogates these issues, as Le Guin does, as we see in much of the science fiction that is looking at social issues and examining them. And that's one of the strengths of this genre, of the fantasy genre.
And I had mentioned War of the Worlds, and of course, like when we think of War of the Worlds, oh, the Martians are coming down, they're invading, and they have advanced technology. And you had pointed out that they are exterminating humans. They're treating us as the bugs. And yet, when we
Yeah,
think
we're the
about it,
bug.
yeah, but when we think about it, it's very much the typical sort of colonial story, except told from the position of the colonized, of this idea of the foreign invader arriving in a land with more sophisticated technology, more sophisticated killing machines, and wiping out local populations, and then ultimately being defeated by the local bacteria, viruses. In this case, not malaria, not the English arriving somewhere
But an
taking over.
analog, yeah.
And yet that's an aspect of the War of the Worlds that we don't generally discuss. It's when we see adaptations of it, it's the quite often the plucky inhabitants standing up against these things and holding out until nature takes its toll. And we don't think about it as essentially an inversion of Western countries invading these other countries, colonizing them, and then having their populations or their colonization efforts halted by uh, viruses or local conditions that we don't think
And,
about
and
from this position.
and Wells asking the readers, okay, if you want to mechanize war, if you want to make it a very efficient process, and if you will, sanitize it and just make it like a squirting bug spray out of your on your lawn and getting rid of these pesky invaders or rather locals. How do you like that, right? Is this what you really want? Is this what we is this the end game that we should be heading towards?
And this is something I time and time again in science fiction that is comes up. Like the screwfly solution is a brilliant story about this. About how these humans are, oh, this is how we deal with an infestation of screw flies so that we can take over the area and utilize it. And then it's set against the backdrop of all of this unrest and violence that's being perpetrated. That's ultimately ending up in all of these humans dying. And it's two alien real estate agents who are going, yeah, we're just getting rid of the pesky human infestation because we want the planet to utilize as we want. And that jarring juxtaposition of treating the annihilation of something as matter of fact and justified because it's what we want to do. Because we always think of ourselves as the center of it and the most important, but then having it applied, well, what if it was applied to us? And that's it.
Yeah.
Science fiction and fantasy find a way to explore a lot of these things, removing it from a lot of the knee-jerk reactions that we have. If you pick an actual conflict, there will be tensions about the various loyalties or histories of the conflict. And we're not thinking about what is going on. We're built with an understanding or an aspect of tribalism in it that we have to support one side over the other, that it becomes very difficult to distance ourselves from that. And yet, what fantasy and science fiction can do is they take that step back and go, let's take this conflict. And we've seen it, say, with where I grew up, with Northern Ireland, that when you're on the ground and when you have grown up with it, people's reductive or simplified notion of what was happening was often insulting. And growing up with it, it was very difficult to deal with, because I lived away from that for quite some time and I would meet people and they would have these opinions on it. I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. But they were very, very confident because they had this sliver of an idea about it.
Mhm.
That taking something like that conflict that had deep historical, cultural, religious, national, ideological roots, it's enormously complicated, but we can literalize that, put it into a science fiction or fantasy setting, and actually play around with the arguments.
Mhm. So there's the genre, fantasy and science fiction. There it is acting at its best, and challenging the reader, challenging their preconceptions, challenging their assumptions, pointing out perhaps moral adumbrations, moral blind spots, things like that.
And it's certainly something that growing up in that situation, you would see these interviews where people were absolutely convinced that they were the good guys. Like, look at what you're doing, regardless of what side of the divide you were on. Look at what you just did. Oh, but I was justified because we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. This simplification of the conflict, the demonization of the other side. And that is comforting. That is conciliatory. That it makes you feel safe and secure. And it's very easy to get a handle on because it's not complicated, nice and straightforward.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And I think that's the attraction of it. That's why it works so well for power fantasies. It works so well for revenge fantasies. It works so well in some of those examples we were talking about in the Western or in the lone cop sort of story or that simplification of it. Give us a really, really bad guy so that we, the audience, we, the reader, the narrative is making it really clear that they're bad. And because they're bad, we, on the side of the heroes, we are justified in whatever we do without thinking about it too clearly. That they're bad, we're good, therefore this is justified. That's very, very reductive. And it's easy to exaggerate those evil traits.
And I hope that the reader would start to see it elsewhere, perhaps in politics, perhaps in news feeds, to see this shorthand of dehumanization going on and being able to recognize it. I would hope.
Has 2,000 years of of various historical propaganda pieces not told us that that is a
Yeah,
forlorn
not
hope.
even that's enough. Yes. Must we go on? Uh,
Um, but we can understand why that is so seductive
yes.
because it does give us that certainty and that comfort. If we're on the side of heroes and they're all villainous, and authors can create that. The orcs must be evil, therefore it is absolutely fine. And you can't question it because how dare you side with the orcs? You're like, no, but think about it outside of that rule that was created within the narrative. What is it actually depicting? Because those narratives, that demonization, dehumanization, and the complacency that that gives us, that is used against us in the real world. That's used in propaganda, that's used in these things. And there's a reason why these fantasies are so popular because it does give us that sense of security and comfort, knowing that we could be powerful in that way. And it's a straightforward solution. Like why think about a complex judicial system and penal system or the different approaches to dealing with prisoners and criminals? Can they be rehabilitated? No, no, let's just kill them all. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's direct, no nuance. And I think one of the accusations against fantasy as a genre is that because it so frequently sanitizes violence in this way, so frequently has that moral simplicity or reductiveness, that's why it can be so often accused of being juvenile or adolescent, because it's not dealing with those complexities. And yet, we know from liking the genre, enjoying the genre, that there are thousands of works that actually delve into this in some aspects greater than others, but are playing with it. Some of our favorite fantasy narratives deal with that complexity.
Mhm. And
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 yet,
much of that critiquing is inappropriate too, because as you pointed out, like to say, well, I don't like the Star Wars world because it's simplistic. Well, that it's supposed to be. It's for kids. It was written for kids. So to call an orange and to critique it for being an orange is rather silly.
that orange is very citrusy. I, but, and I think this is, we sometimes forget that when we look at things and people go, oh, we see this in comparisons. Oh, if you liked X fantasy series, you will like Y fantasy series. And I sometimes look at these recommendations and say, why are you? Yes, they are both fantasy. Yes, they are both series, but that's heroic adventure fantasy. That's sort of military fantasy. This one over here is libertarian fantasy. This one over here is progressive. Like there are so many different distinctions, but people go, it's fantasy and a series. Therefore, that's enough of the similarities. And often the what an author is doing with it is radically different. Robin Hobb's first trilogy in the what was it the Assassin's Apprentice. So all of those books. I've temporarily forgotten the name of the series, but Robin Hobb's Assassin trilogy, which is the first, and it's then followed by the Live Ship trilogy, and it's then followed by was it the Fits and the Fool? But the first trilogy, it's called Assassin's Apprentice, and I remember someone leaving a diatribe review about it, complaining that it wasn't a good book, it was badly written, and it was. But when everything on the blurb was accurate, but the assassin in it is being trained as an actual assassin. So there's PTSD. There's, it's not crawling in through the air ducts to assassinate someone and then crawling out again. It's no, I'm going to poison their food and walk off, and they'll get
Mhm.
poisoned at a later date when I'm not in the room. It was a very different sort of approach than the idea of the adventure Jason Bourne or John Wick style assassin who's going to go in and kill lots of people. If that's what assassins did, armies would be made out of them. That's not what assassins do.
Yes.
But it was the confusion of an action adventure fantasy story about an assassin with something that was a very different thing.
Mm.
Again, both fantasies. There was a series. What was it called? In it, the one of the things I remember is that the master assassins are called wet boys, and I always thought that was a very silly term to be using within this. But it's an adolescent power fantasy about being an uber powerful killer who can go around and kill people. And again, a lot of people are singled out as hyper evil, so can just be killed. But it plays into that power fantasy. And if you're looking for that style of story, then Robin Hobb's much more mature and psychological storytelling
Hmm.
is not going to scratch that itch. And there's a time and place for both. They are serving different audiences, different purposes. And yes, they are both fantasies. The Night Angel trilogy by Brent Weeks, that was the name of the trilogy. Um, but they are radically different. So just because they have an assassin and they are in a fantasy world, people go, "Oh, if you read that one, you'll like this one." You're like, no, they radically different stories.
It's a very diverse place. Yeah.
So, well, thank you very much for this quite rambling discussion that we've had.
Rambling, very rambling discussion. Oh, and credit to Steve. He told us it was Unforgiven was the
Unforgiven,
title of the Western that I was reaching for that sort of put an end to a lot of those Western cliche traditions that I
yeah,
thought.
Erickson occasionally comes up with a good point.
Well, well, thank
Um,
you. Thanks for this discussion.
well, and thank you very much for having it with me. And I will see you soon. And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.